It was 02:17 a.m. when I first heard that sound coming from the wall. At first, I thought it was just the normal creaking of an old building, but then it came again, clearer this time, as if someone was slowly dragging their fingernails through the inside of the wall. Right at that moment, a notification on my phone changed everything. My voice recording app had opened on its own, and the recording title simply read, "Someone is inside the wall." In that moment, I knew I was home alone. My name is Daniel. I'm 28 years old, and about 2 months ago, I moved into an old but cheap apartment a bit far from the city center. Honestly, the only reason I chose this place was the affordable rent. I wasn't earning much at my job and couldn't afford anything better. The building was old, the walls were thin, and there were strange noises at night, but I always took it as normal because that's what happens in old buildings. At least, that's what I thought until that night. In the beginning, everything was normal. I'd go to work, come home, spend some time, and sleep. I didn't really know my neighbors, but I'd hear occasional footsteps from upstairs or the sound of a TV from the next unit, just ordinary apartment sounds, nothing noteworthy. But for the past few days, the sounds from the walls had been increasing, first light tapping, then scraping, and finally, rhythmic sounds that made me think someone was moving inside, but I didn't want to accept it. I forced myself toward logical explanations. Maybe pipes, maybe rats, maybe just my imagination. But something inside me said that wasn't it. And that night, I realized it for certain. I was trying to sleep that night, but the moment I closed my eyes, I heard it again. That faint scraping sound from inside the wall was much closer this time, as if it were coming from the wall right behind my head. It jolted me wide awake. I sat up in bed and just listened for a few seconds. The room was completely silent, but within that silence there was that sound. It wasn't regular. It was random but felt conscious, as if someone inside was trying to find their way. Holding my breath, I leaned closer to the wall and pressed my ear against it. I knew how ridiculous I was being, but curiosity was stronger than fear. What I heard in that moment froze me completely. There was the sound of breathing coming from inside the wall. It was very faint but continuous. This wasn't a pipe, and it wasn't an animal because the rhythm was human, slow, steady, and conscious. In that instant, all my logical explanations vanished. I pulled back, but I couldn't take my eyes off the wall because now I knew something was there. The moment that thought settled in my mind, my phone vibrated on the table. I startled and looked at the screen. The voice recording app was open. I hadn't opened it, but the recording was active and the timer was counting up. For a few seconds, I didn't know what to do, but then I decided to stop the recording and listen. I played the recording. The first few seconds were silence, then my own breathing because I had just leaned toward the wall. But a few seconds later, another sound began. The sound from inside the wall had been recorded, but this time it was clearer. And it wasn't just a scraping sound, it was someone whispering. I couldn't make out the words, but the rhythm was distinct, as if someone was talking in a very low, unintelligible voice. My fear reached a whole new level because this wasn't just a presence anymore. It meant someone was there intentionally. I turned off the recording, my hands shaking. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police, check the door, or just leave the house immediately? But I couldn't do any of it because I heard the sound again. This time, it wasn't from the wall. It came from the ceiling. I slowly lifted my head and my heart nearly stopped. On the ceiling, there was a thin line covered by paint, and that line was moving very slowly, as if someone was crawling inside the ceiling. As that line continued to move, I couldn't take my eyes off it. What I was seeing shouldn't have been real, but it was. The paint wasn't cracking or falling. It was just progressing as a very thin track, and I could feel something moving beneath it, as if someone was crawling right behind the ceiling, parallel to me. The most terrifying part was that this movement wasn't random, it had a direction. It was coming directly over my bed. I backed away from the bed, nearly falling, but my eyes were still on the ceiling. When that line reached the spot right above my bed, it stopped. For a few seconds, nothing happened, as if that thing had stopped there to wait for me. A strange sensation washed over me, as if it were looking down at me from above. My breathing quickened, my heart felt like it would burst through my chest, and at that moment, a very soft click came from inside the ceiling, then another, and then a tiny piece fell from the ceiling. A speck of white paint floated slowly to the floor. I realized then that everything was out of my control. This wasn't just sound anymore. It was physical, it was real, and it was getting closer. I backed up and leaned against the wall, but that was a mistake. At that moment, the breathing sound came from the wall again, and this time it was much closer. It wasn't just on the other side of the wall. It was inside the wall, and this thing now knew where I was. I looked at my phone again, and what I noticed completely shattered me. The voice recording app had opened once more, and a new recording had started. This time, the title was different. He is listening. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just an occurrence, it was communication. This thing was noticing what I was doing, watching me, and even playing with me. I didn't dare open the recording, but a few seconds later the app stopped on its own and the recording played automatically. This time there was only one sound, clear, close. It wasn't coming from the wall, it was coming from inside the room. Move. 2 words were so clear that my brain tried to reject them, but it couldn't, because I had heard this voice before. It was my own voice. The moment I heard that voice, something inside me broke completely. This was no longer a situation that could be explained. It wasn't just someone being inside the wall. This thing knew me, it was mimicking my voice, and most terrifyingly, it was commanding me. The moment it said, "Don't move," my body instinctively froze. It felt as though those words hadn't just reached my ears, but had been spoken directly into my mind. I couldn't move. For a few seconds, I barely even noticed myself breathing. My eyes were still on the ceiling. The thin crack was motionless, but my gut told me this was just a pause, as if that thing was watching me and measuring my reaction. Then I realized something even more frightening. This wasn't an attack. It was like a game, a patient, controlled, and conscious game. I made a mistake. I closed my eyes. Maybe I wanted to think it was all just a game my mind was playing on me. But that thought lasted only a second, because I immediately heard a very faint scraping sound right by my ear. It was so close that I opened my eyes by reflex and my breath hitched. The wall was moving. There was a slight ripple under the paint, as if something was shifting inside the wall rather than behind it. This movement was right at the level of my head, as if that thing had approached me through the wall and now only a thin layer stood between us. I wanted to pull back, but I couldn't. My feet felt as if they were bolted to the floor. Only my eyes could move. At that moment, a small crack appeared in the wall, a very thin, barely noticeable line. Through that line, a dark void was visible. No light reflected from it. Its depth was uncertain. It was just a void, and from within that void, something was looking at me. I didn't see it with my eyes, but I felt it. That sensation of being watched was so powerful that all my resistance collapsed. And then I heard that voice again, this time closer, clearer, almost inside my ear. Good. Knees shook when I heard that word. This thing understood my fear. It was reacting, and it was enjoying it. I realized that not moving didn't stop it. On the contrary, it was bringing it closer. Right then, a loud sound came from the ceiling, a snapping sound. I looked up, and what I saw destroyed all my belief in reality. That thin line on the ceiling suddenly widened, and a thick darkness seeped out. This wasn't a shadow, it was a void, something that swallowed light. From inside that void, something long and thin reached out, a hand. But it wasn't a normal hand. The fingers were much longer than they should have been, and its movement, it wasn't natural, as if the bones were misplaced. That hand slowly dangled down, directly toward where my bed was. In that moment, the last shred of my control vanished. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. I just watched. The hand hung in the air for a few seconds and then slowly withdrew, entering that darkness again. The ceiling returned to its previous state. The crack closed. Everything looked as if it had never happened, but I knew this wasn't the end, because that thing was no longer hiding. It was playing with me, and the game was just beginning. The moment the hand disappeared, the room was plunged back into silence, but this silence was no longer comforting. Instead, it was heavier, more threatening. I knew now what was possible in this house, and that knowledge was more terrifying than anything. For a few seconds, nothing happened. No sound, no movement. But this stillness was like the calm before a storm. Then, my phone vibrated again. I didn't want to look at the screen, but I had to. It had become part of these events, as if that thing was communicating with me through this device. When I looked at the screen, what I saw felt like a punch to the stomach. The voice recording app had opened once more, and this time the title was a single word. Come. The moment I saw that word, a strange urge formed inside me. It wasn't just a message, it was a summons. Resisting it was becoming difficult. My logic told me it was a trap, but my body wasn't listening. I slowly stood up. I didn't want to do this, but I couldn't stop. My steps were slow and uncontrolled, as if someone was pulling me with invisible strings. I realized the sound wasn't just coming from the walls anymore, it was everywhere. It was coming from every direction, the ceiling, the floor, the walls, all humming at that low frequency simultaneously, and this sound was boring directly into my mind. I stepped out into the hallway. The lights were off, everywhere was dark, but the darkness wasn't normal. It was like a void that light couldn't reach, and something was moving inside that void. As my eyes tried to adjust, I began to see shapes within the darkness. They weren't clear, but they were there, as if the walls themselves were moving, not just things inside them. I took another step. My phone was in my hand, the screen was still on. And at that moment, a new recording played automatically. This time there were multiple voices, whispers, but they were all the same. They were all my voice. In different tones, at different speeds, but they all belonged to me, and they were all saying the same thing: come closer. As those words echoed, my head began to spin. This was no longer just fear. It was a mental assault, and resisting was getting harder and harder. A few seconds later, I found myself in the middle of the hallway, and at that exact moment, the surface of the wall began to ripple in front of me, just like in the room, but this time bigger, more distinct. As if the wall was no longer a surface, but a thin curtain. Something was behind it, something very large, and it was trying to push its way out through this curtain. A protrusion formed, a human-like shape, then another and another at different points on the wall. Multiple things were moving. Then I understood. There wasn't just one in this house. I wanted to pull back, but it was too late. The surface of the wall suddenly tore open, and that dark void was fully revealed for the first time. This wasn't a hole, it was a gateway. The thing that emerged from that gateway was indescribably wrong. Its shape resembled a human, but the proportions were distorted, the movements were erratic, and its face was gone. Just like I had sensed in the room, it was only a dark void, but it wasn't alone. Behind it were more, countless silhouettes moving within that darkness, all stirring at once. In that moment, the fear inside me was completely replaced by despair. This wasn't a situation you could escape from. This was a siege, and I was right in the center of it. The first thing to emerge approached me slowly. Its steps were silent, but its presence was so heavy it felt like the air had densified. Breathing became difficult. I stumbled backward, but the wall was behind me. I had nowhere left to run. That thing tilted its head slightly, then it spoke. But this time, it wasn't just my voice. Multiple voices were layered on top of each other. They all belonged to me. He's ready. The moment that sentence was uttered, the wall behind me suddenly softened. I no longer felt a hard surface against my back. It was as if the wall had melted. I lost my balance and fell backward. When my hand reflexively hit the wall, I felt my fingers sink into it. The wall wasn't solid. It looked like a surface, but it was hollow, and it was pulling me in. I screamed, but no sound came out because all those whispers started again, louder this time, more intense, and all of them synchronized into a single sentence: come home. Body began to be slowly pulled into the wall, first my hand, then my arm, then my shoulder. In that moment, I looked out one last time, because I knew there was no coming back. The last thing I saw was the inside of the room, empty, silent, as if nothing had ever happened. Then I was plunged into total darkness. There are no official records of what happened to that apartment after the event. The tenant was listed as missing. Police found no signs of forced entry, and the file was closed shortly after. But the story doesn't end there, because the new tenants who moved into that building began complaining about the same thing a few weeks later. Sounds coming from the walls at night, whispers, and sometimes they say they hear their own voices.